In this topic, we shall look at the framework of the central administration used by the British in Kenya. We are also going to look at the reasons why they used indirect rule and the effects of indirect rule in Kenya. As we discussed earlier, indirect rule was a British system of administration where African chiefs who were in power before the coming of the British were allowed to continue ruling under the British district commissioners. In order to effectively administer Kenya, the British government introduced a central government which had the following structure: the colonial secretary based in London, the governor or chief executive officer based in Nairobi, the provincial commissioners who are in charge of provinces, district commissioners who are in charge of districts, and division officers. What was the role of African chiefs in the colonial administration setup? African chiefs worked under district officers. Some of the African chiefs had been in power before colonization. The African chiefs had the following duties: solving petty disputes among Africans, maintaining law and order, collection of taxes, mobilizing African labor for public works, explaining colonial government policies to the people, and organizing public barazas. There were several reasons that made the British to apply indirect rule in Kenya. Some of them are: it was cheap because African chiefs did not require to be paid high salaries. The British controlled many colonies and suffered lack of enough personnel. There was less resistance from Africans because they were being ruled by their fellow African chiefs. Due to poor transport and communication network, the British could not access some of the rural areas. The system was already successful in other areas, for example, India. Indirect rule had several effects both on the Africans and Europeans. Some of these effects were: the appointed African chiefs facilitated implementation of colonial laws. It made African communities to remain divided as the appointed chiefs supported colonial administration. The British policy of divide and rule led to isolation of Africans along tribal lines to serve British interests. The creation of chiefs in the former stateless societies made them mediators between the ruler and the ruled. This led to colonial misrule, whereby Africans suffered from unpopular colonial laws. Independent rule prepared Africans for future responsibilities after independence. In this lesson, we shall learn about indirect rule in Nigeria. We shall define indirect rule, reasons for the application of indirect rule in Nigeria, how it was applied, and its effects. What is indirect rule? Indirect rule was a British system of administration where African chiefs who were in power before the coming of the British were allowed to continue ruling under the British administrators. Listen to the following conversation between Captain Lugard and the colonial secretary.
Good morning, Mr. Lugard.
Good morning, sir.
I hope this time you've brought me good report about northern Nigeria.
Sir.
Last time you proposed the use of indirect rule in northern Nigeria. Do you still hold the same view?
Yes, sir. The use of indirect rule is the best method to use, especially in northern Nigeria, sir.
Why do you prefer the use of indirect rule in northern Nigeria?
Sir, you realize that we don't have enough manpower to administer the colony, sir.
That's true, Lugard. That's true. We can take the advantage of the local chiefs and the structure in administering the colony.
Sir, I realize that our government does not have enough funds to pay many administrators, sir.
I'm convinced that you are the right person to oversee this project in West Africa. Do you have any other reason as to why we should use indirect rule in northern Nigeria?
Oh yes, sir. The use of African chiefs will help us. The Africans cannot resist their own chiefs, sir.
That is very wise of you, Logan. I have remembered that we once used indirect rule in our colonies successfully.
It was very successful in India and Uganda. The use of African chiefs will help us to avoid problems because of problems of transport and communication network in this colony, sir.
I will support you, Logan. In any case, we have a very well established system of government in northern Nigeria that will help us to administer this policy successfully.
Yes, sir.
Thank you so much, Lugat, for this information.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you for your support, sir.
I wish you well in Nigeria.
Thank you for your support, sir. I will do my best, sir.
Different European powers used different methods to apply their rule in Africa. In northern Nigeria, indirect rule was applied using the following methods. Northern Nigeria was divided into emirates headed by emirs. Emirs were left to rule their own people. Frederick Lugard assured the emirs that the British did not intend to replace them, hence they cooperated. Lugard allowed the emirs to impose and collect taxes as before. They were also allowed to judge cases in their courts. The emirs retained their powers to appoint officials in charge of villages. In each province, Lugard created a protectorate court to serve as a court of appeal presided over by Africans. Indirect rule was faced by several challenges while being applied in Nigeria. Some of these challenges were: southern Nigeria had many different ethnic groups with diverse political and religious systems. The attempt by Frederick Lugard to give more powers to the Yoruba traditional leaders proved futile. Egba community resisted paying taxes. Among the Igbo community, Lugard had appointed young mission-educated men to the position of emirs. These were opposed by the elders. There was no common language in the south because elite used English while others used their local languages. Indirect rule in southern Nigeria affected Africans and Europeans in several ways. The role of African traditional rulers was transformed. The indigenous systems of administration and justice were modernized by the British. African chiefs accumulated a lot of wealth at the expense of their people. Developments like introduction of Christianity, Western education and technology took time before gaining root. Indirect rule created suspicion and mistrust between the educated elite and traditional chiefs. Indirect rule helped to preserve African culture. In this lesson, we will discuss the British colonial system with reference to Zimbabwe. We shall learn direct rule, identify reasons for direct rule, process and effects of the same. Direct rule was a system that involved the use of European administrators in all the units of administration from the highest to the lowest. It was used in colonies with a large white population and in areas that faced constant revolts against European colonial rule. Zimbabwe was one of the colonies where the British extensively used direct rule because of the following reasons. Zimbabwe had a large white population. The Africans, especially the Ndebele, kept on revolting against colonial rule. The British South Africa Company had enough personnel for administration. They wanted to fully exploit the natural resources. The traditional system of administration was dismantled and the local chiefs were deprived of their powers. Europeans never intended Zimbabwe to be given independence at any time. A process is the way things are done. British direct rule in Zimbabwe began effectively on 4th November 1893. The British South Africa Company hoisted the Union flag, and by 1895, the new British colony was named Rhodesia after Cecil Rhodes. The administration was authoritative and managed by the white minorities. The structure used in administering Zimbabwe was as follows. The highest officer in Zimbabwe was the governor, who was under the colonial secretary. There was a legislative council that was dominated by white minority. The prime minister controlled the legislature and the cabinet that was made up of only whites. There were magistrates who dealt with issues affecting the settlers. There were native commissioners who settled cases involving Africans. The Native Affairs Department was equivalent to a district under a white officer assisted by African chiefs. The chiefs had no powers but were supported to implement orders from the native commissioners. The application of direct rule in Zimbabwe had the following effects. Settlement of whites who took most of the fertile land. Africans were displaced to semi-arid reserves. The power and authority of African traditional chiefs was undermined. It led to imposition of heavy taxes on Africans. Africans were subjected to forced labor. African economic activities were disrupted. Racial segregation legalized the oppression of Africans by the whites. Unilateral Declaration of Independence by Ian Smith in 1965 delayed the attainment of real independence in Zimbabwe up to 1980.
Assimilation means similar or to resemble. This meant that the assimilated Africans were the same as the Europeans in terms of culture. Assimilation policy meant that the assimilated Africans acquired the same status as the French people.
Assimilation policy was an administration policy used by the French, which was intended to create Frenchmen out of black Africans. The main characteristics of this type of administrations were as follows. Colonies were regarded as overseas departments of France. The colonized people were to adopt the French culture. Colonies elected representatives to the French Parliament. There were common legal practices in French colonies with those of France. French language was used as the official language for communication. Introduction of French system of education. An attempt to transform the Africans in Senegal into Frenchmen in black skins.
The assimilated Africans had the following privileges: were granted French citizenship, were treated as African Frenchmen, enjoyed educational opportunities like the Frenchmen, were employed in the French civil service, enjoyed the same voting rights as the Frenchmen, could send representatives to represent them in the French Chamber of Deputies, enjoyed similar trading rights like Frenchmen, and were exempted from forced labor, taxation, and other forms of discrimination.
Assimilation policy failed in most parts of Africa because cultures cannot die overnight, which is what the French wanted. In addition, most of the French nationals were opposed to the idea of elevating Africans to be their equals. Other factors that resulted to the failure of this policy are as follows. It was an expensive policy to implement and sustain. The policy was confined to the 4 communes of Senegal, while the interior was not affected. Cultural differences between the Africans and the French, such as polygamy practiced by the Africans, while the French advocated for monogamy. racial discrimination whereby the French resented the idea of equality with Africans. The assimilation policy had several effects on the people of France and Africa. The policy of assimilation undermined African culture. The authority of the traditional African leaders were eroded. The colony was incorporated into the French Republic. Africans in Senegal were allowed to participate in the political matters of France. The assimilation policy frustrated the spread of Islam, especially in the French Quarter communes.